similar to mine. As you might be interested to what is said on that board there. There's a quote from Alan Greenspan, in any case, which basically says that a currency issuing central government cannot become insolvent with respect to obligations in its own currency. When the currency is a fiat currency, it can produce such claims without limit. Anyway, let me just click this on. Hopefully this works.
More expert statement on this, and then I'll let it rest because I'll assume I.
This is Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal
Reserve. This is Alan Greenspan when he is under oath as chairman of the Federal Reserve. He is faced with a question from Congressman Paul Ryan. Now the question is about Social Security, but it doesn't matter that the question is about Social Security. It could be about defense spending. It could be about education spending. It could be about infrastructure spending. It could be about student debt. It could be about anything. What matters is his answer. Okay, so let me play Alan Greenspan. Recognize that Greenspan is not the clearest speaker in the entire world, so after you listen to him, I will rephrase.
So having personal retirement accounts is another way of making a future retiree benefits more secure for their retirement. And also, do you believe that personal retirement accounts as a component to a system of solvency does help improve solvency?
Superannuation.
Because when you have a personal retirement account policy, it's accompanied with a benefit offset. With that feature in place, do you believe that personal retirement accounts can help us achieve solvency for the system and make those future retiree benefits more secure?
Well, I wouldn't say that the pay-as-you-go benefits are insecure in the sense that there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody. The question is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets
stuff in the middle
are created which those benefits are employed to purchase? So it's not a question of security, it's a question of the structure of a financial system which assures that the real resources are created for retirement as distinct from the cash. The cash itself is nice to have, but it's got to be in the context of the real resources being created at the time those benefits are paid, so that you can purchase real resources with the benefits, which of course are cash.
Mm-hmm.
Come on.
He kept the job because nobody could understand what he said.
Okay, so basically similar to what I said, he said it in a slightly different way. And what he was basically saying was, it's not, first, the federal government, US federal government, can create as much money as it likes and hand it over to pensioners. The only thing that really matters is that there's enough real stuff for pensioners to purchase. Okay? And of course, that can be a potential problem because workers earn the income from the goods that are produced, and they'll want them all. So, in order for pensioners to get some of that stuff without it being inflationary, the government taxes the working population to reduce some of its spending power to free up some of those real assets, goods and services that might not just be cars or TV sets, they might be hospital beds and so on. They have to be goods with private goods characteristics, they could have public goods characteristics. So let me just summarise. So the issue that matters is, will the real assets exist in the future for retirees, pension super checks to purchase? So I'm saying if you're on a super, just imagine sitting a pension check a fortnight, you get a super check. So will the basic goods and services, the health facilities, the nursing homes, etc., be available for retirees to claim with their pension super checks? As the population ages and the working population shrinks, the ability of a nation to provide these real assets will depend on, one, the productivity of the working population, or in other words, the economy's sustainable productive capacity, and two, what proportion of the real stuff being produced is made available in the form of the real stuff needed and desired by retirees. Because it doesn't have to be hospitals. The working population can say, no, we don't want that. And even the retirees can say, we don't want hospitals. Okay, if I get ill, there won't be a hospital. But in the meantime, I'd rather be purchasing something else. It doesn't have to be, but at least there are choices available if the real stuff is available, because the economy has the productive capacity. It's not a choice about money. Let me just continue on. I'll try and keep this to about 5 or so minutes at most. Okay, so you don't have to agree with me or Alan Greenspan, but let's just assume the currency issue, federal government, then the currency issuing central government has no budget constraint. Then you ask the question, and I've sort of answered this already, but I'm going to go through it again. Won't the federal government's exploitation of this bottomless pit of Australian dollars lead to hyperinflation? Because every time I say this, I say, you just get a Zimbabwe. In fact, I like to use Zimbabwe as the poster boy. It's a classic example of a currency issuing central government that's got access to as much money as it likes. In 2008, the amount of money created by the Zimbabwean government for spending and other purposes increased 1 millionfold. People say, oh yeah, but Phil, that's because it's run by a dictator. Well, dictators can make the improbable possible, but they can't make the impossible possible. How was the Zimbabwean government able to create all this money? It was because it's the owner and issuer of the Zimbabwean dollar. No different to the federal government here in Australia being the owner and issuer of the Australian dollar. If the Australian government wanted to access itself 1 million times more money than it's spending right now in the space of 12 months, it could do it. It would be foolish to spend it. It would just be hyperinflationary. You would get the Zimbabwean situation. But that's a different issue. How you exploit it. The question here is, does a central government have unlimited access to the nation's currency, the currency issuing central government? And the answer is yes. Okay, so I'll just give you a 2-minute, or 30 seconds, whatever it is, lesson on inflation. I'm going to talk about one particular type of inflation, because whenever I say this and someone says, Phil, that'll just be inflationary, what they're referring to is demand pull inflation. Now, demand pull inflation occurs when there is excessive government spending. Not because they're running out of money, but they're creating too much of this stuff and spending too much into existence, that's all. Compared to the taxation, the amount they're destroying. Excessive government spending is referred to demand pull inflation. It occurs when my spending, plus your spending, because you're the private sector and I'm the public sector, exceeds the productive capacity of the economy. Exceeds the ability of the economy to produce the real stuff that we're going to purchase with our money. Now that productive capacity is sometimes referred to as the full employment level of income. Right? So when you reach the productive, the total spending equals the productive capacity of the economy, then it means any further spending will not lead to any further output, because when you reach the productive capacity of the economy, all resources are fully employed, including human beings willing to work. Okay, so any further spending just causes inflation. It does not lead to an increase in real goods and services being produced, because you've reached your productive capacity. If total spending is less than the productive capacity of the economy, then there is no demand pull inflation at all, but there is unemployment. So if total spending is less than the productive capacity of the economy, you will have unemployment. And that's been the situation in Australia for about the last 40 odd years. Total spending has been less than the productive capacity of the economy. That's why we've had unemployment, not had full employment for 40 odd years. Don't listen to the people who said around about 2007, when the official unemployment rate was around about 4.1%, that we had full employment. At the time, there was 450,000 unemployed Australians, and 150,000 of them had been unemployed for 12 months or more, and there were 500,000 underemployed Australians. So there were 950,000 Australians who were either unemployed or underemployed at the time. That's now 1.8 million. There's 1.8 million Australians who are either unemployed or underemployed at the moment. So clearly, total spending is well short of the productive capacity of the Australian economy. So that's the reason why, despite these deficits the government's now running, it's not inflationary. People say, well, why isn't it? Because total spending is less than the productive capacity of the economy. That's all that matters. It's not looking at the budget position. It's quite possible to have a demand pull inflation with the government running a surplus, if private sector spending is strong enough. If the combined, the aggregate, the combined spending of you and me, therefore the total spending, relative to the productive capacity that matters. I can run a surplus, but if you're borrowing so much that your spending, plus mine, exceeds the productive capacity of the economy, there will be demand pull inflation, even though I'm running a surplus. So you can have demand pull inflation with a surplus, and you can have unemployment when you've got governments running a deficit. Ideally, you want total spending to exactly equal productive capacity. That's how you'd love the economy to run. That means you'd have full employment all the time. And in fact, I would argue that, and of course you'd have minimal inflation. You might have a little bit, something between 2 or 3%, which is deemed to be acceptable. And you can have that. And that's basically how the Australian economy was run from about 1945 to about 1973, 74.
Until Margaret Thatcher.
Sorry?
Until Margaret Thatcher.
Well, one of the reasons why problems arose in 1973 was because of the oil price shot.
Yeah.
It created inflation, but it wasn't demand pull inflation, it was cost push inflation. Right? And that created a problem because economists don't want to know about cost push inflation. Okay, they only believe that the major form of inflation is demand pull inflation. We haven't had demand pull inflation in this country for 40 odd years. How do I know? We haven't had full employment for 40 odd years. Remember, total spending has to exceed the full employment level. For that to happen, you must have full employment to start with. It's all been cost push, and cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is where the cost of doing things rises because you have perhaps something like an oil price shock. But it's usually a symptom of the structural deficiencies of the economy. You can have wage pressures within the economy, even though you've got a lot of people unemployed, because the skills of the work, well, people either working or seeking work, don't match the skills being demanded by employers. So you get build-up of wage pressures in particular labour markets. Right? That's caused by having an inadequate training system, in my opinion, and an education system that doesn't produce graduates of the type that employers, or in the quantities that employers demand. Right? So, I'm sure in Adelaide tonight there will be a lot of people working behind bars and making coffee that have got degrees in accountancy. Right? We've got too many accountants, but and the introduction of the 457 visa is because we don't have enough tradespeople, even though we've got unemployed people, because we're not training. So we've got a mismatch between skills, demand and skills supply, which can lead to wage pressures in certain labour markets. That's cost push inflationary pressure. Other reason why you can get cost push inflationary pressure is because you can have a problem of scarcity of resources. But governments don't like that cost push inflationary pressure to emerge in the economy. And they make sure that it doesn't emerge in the economy, because in order to get natural resources and environmental services to be adequately priced, because of the characteristics of those services and goods, they're not assigned a price naturally by the market. It requires the government to put a price on them, like a price on carbon, all right? Which of course creates cost push inflationary pressure. Now, no one wants inflation, but my view is that cost push inflation is something you wear and you deal with in the proper way. You don't kill the Australian economy off. You don't kick it in the guts by raising interest rates or cutting government spending. You say, okay, we've got a cost push inflationary problem. It's clearly the result of some structural weakness or deficiency of the economy. Let's deal with the structural weakness. It may take longer to deal with that weakness and reduce the cost push inflationary pressure. That's the price of bad policy in the past. But when you use higher interest rates or you use cuts in government spending as a means of reducing demand, which is really a way of dealing with demand pull inflationary pressure rather than cost push inflationary pressure, you do kill off the inflation, but you mask the structural deficiency and you never deal with it. And it just remains, and you go off in some unsustainable pathway. So there's no reason why that's the second to last dot point, why currency and central government cannot net spend to ensure there is always spending equal to the productive full employment level of GDP. They face no financial constraint in doing this. And this explains why the huge budget deficits of the US federal government in the 2008-2011 period weren't inflationary. During that period, the US federal government's budget deficits as a percentage of GDP were the largest since World War II. Effectively, they ran the biggest budget deficit since World War II. During that period since World War II, there has been, at times, high inflation in the USA, high interest rates. Why was inflation very, very low in the US at the time, and the Fed funds rate, I was referring to that cash rate that the Reserve Bank sets at 2 point. It's called the Fed funds rate in the USA. It was during that period marginally above 0%. How can that be explained? It's interesting when I ask that question to professors of economics, they have difficulty explaining that. Yet I would expect a reasonable, not a brilliant, a reasonable first-year macroeconomics student to answer that question correctly. And the reason why it wasn't inflationary was because despite these huge deficits by the US federal government, huge injection of spending by the US federal government into the US economy, private sector spending had fallen so much that the combined spending, the total spending, private sector plus the federal government spending, was still less than the productive capacity of the US economy. How do I know? Because the official unemployment rate in the US at the time was 9 to 10%. That's how I know. So conclusions. A currency issuing central government can always net spend to a level that ensures total spending equals the full employment level of GDP. It should never spend beyond this level. Anyone who would recommend that is a fool. So there's this belief that people like me just want to point this out so governments can go on a wild spending spree. No. I would never recommend that a central government deficit spend to the point that total spending exceeds the productive capacity of the economy. Why? It's not going to reduce unemployment. You've got full employment. It's not going to produce, you're not going to get any more goods and services because you've used up all the resources that are available at that point in time. It's just going to be inflationary. But if in doing that, the government is operating a deficit, so what? The government's got a bottomless pit of the nation's currency at its disposal. And if in doing that every year, making sure that total spending is equal to the full employment level of income, the central government, the currency issuing central government is running a deficit. It can do it forever. It can run deficit. And in the meantime, because, as I said, when I'm running a deficit, I'm injecting more spending power than I'm destroying through taxation. Your financial assets, possession of financial assets, is rising. It was almost impossible in the 1960s to have a major financial crisis. And the reason for that was because there was almost a period of probably 20-25 years where central governments, and some of these were conservative governments, were running deficits year after year after year. The private sector was flush with net financial assets. So if things went amiss for a little while, they just were able to acquire some of their savings, their net savings that they'd accumulated to get through that little bit of a rough period. And of course, it wasn't a very long rough period because the central government was always prepared to up its spending to make sure total spending was at the full employment level. And so it was only a short little, so you had a minor increase in unemployment. And if the government was a bit lazy in responding and that the unemployment went to 3% like it did in 1961, the government almost got booted out. The Menzies government, I think, got up by 1 seat. Won the election by 1 seat because the unemployment rate went up to 3%. And that was considered unacceptable.
Lots of companies went broke during that credit squeeze, though.
They did, but it didn't have a major effect on the Australian economy.
Philip, one word and one concept you haven't addressed is deflation, apropos inflation. Would you like to tell us?
Oh, well, you could have that. If total spending within the economy is, as I said, total spending exceeds the full employment level, you get inflation. Right? More demand than the goods available for sale, you get inflation. If it's exactly equal, you get full employment, you get a low bit of inflation. If it's less, you've got unemployment. If the gap between what's required to have full employment and what you do have is sufficiently large enough, it is possible to have deflation. But that's very rare.
And it's not good when you get it. Right?
Sorry? No, it's not. No. You want prices to be fairly constant. Now, can I just spend 5 more minutes? Just 5 more. Yeah. All right. I just want to make these last points. All right. Taxes paid by. I know I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, but because I haven't said that much about superannuation. I really want to say that. So taxes paid by the working population do not finance the pension bill. Remember, I just get money out of my bottomless pit of money and hand it over to pensioners. taxes by the working population are merely required to quell the inflationary effect of retiree spending and, of course, the government's own spending. Okay, perhaps I'll miss that first one because I've spent a lot of time on that one. I'll go to the second one. All right. There's this idea that switching from pensions to superannuation will reduce the tax impost on the working population. So the view is, okay, taxes fund the pension, and if all retirees now have a super fund to draw from, rather than getting a pension, then there's no need for the federal government to tax the working population. That's nonsense. Firstly, as I said before, taxes don't finance the pension system. So the working population not being taxed to finance the pension. That's the first thing. Right. In order for retirees to spend, as I mentioned before, in order for retirees to spend in a way that is not inflationary, there's got to, as Alan Greenspan said, there's got to be enough of those that real stuff there available for pensioners and the working population and so forth to purchase with the money that they've got available for spending purposes. So in other words, the central government has got to make sufficient spending room for retirees to spend in a way that is not inflationary. That spending room is required whether or not the spending of retirees is financed by a pension or a cheque or a super cheque. It's irrelevant. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether or not or let's assume we were comparing a situation where all retirees were either on a pension or all retirees were on a super cheque and they're of the same value, all right? But the mainstream view is that the first one, where it's just a pension cheque, will mean the working population won't have to be taxed because taxes finance the pension. When it doesn't matter. In both cases, the working population will have to be taxed because in both cases, to avoid inflationary pressure due to the spending by retirees on that real stuff, whether it's financed by a pension cheque or a super cheque, room has to be made available for those for retirees to access that stuff, and the way in which room is made available is by taxing the working population. So the working population will still have to be taxed. Okay. Worse still, if the superannuation, because one of the so-called benefits of superannuation is that the super cheque that you get is higher than the pension cheque. So you get, as a retiree, more to spend. Well, if superannuation means a higher fortnightly cheque for retirees but doesn't increase the nation's productive capacity relative to having a pension system, and there's no evidence that that's happening, right, since compulsory superannuation has been introduced, there's been no, in fact, if anything, the labour productivity has fallen, then the tax liability of the working population increases because more room has to be made. If retirees have now got a higher cheque each fortnight, it's now a super cheque, then they're going to be claiming more of that real stuff. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You've missed the supply and demand curve. You're an economist.
Okay. I know what I'm talking about, okay? I'm talking completely about supply and demand. Anyway, if retirees have more to spend on those goods and services, the super cheque is higher than the pension cheque, and there's no corresponding increase in the productive capacity of the working population as a result of shifting from a pension system to a super system, then more room's got to be made available for pensioners to access those goods and services. Means the working population is going to be taxed even more. Well, governments, and as I said before, governments don't like, I reckon this is already starting to occur, this problem. Governments don't like taxing people more. So remember the other solution? Rather than reducing the working population spending on that real stuff, the government reduces its spending on that real stuff. And so we've got a rundown of public infrastructure, a desire to cut spending to education and so forth. Okay, but basically, I just want to show a few diagrams, just really quickly. Because I said the real solution is to do something about sustaining, or if not increasing, or maintaining or sustaining the productive capacity of the Australian economy, and I said the government's doing virtually everything to reduce it. And I pointed out that improving labour productivity is very important. So that's one thing in the report that I agree with, but because the way they argue that we go about doing it, I disagree. Let's have a look at labour productivity. Don't worry about the blue line because that's selected parts of the economy. The brown line there shows the growth in labour productivity, and it's in decline. It's been in decline. I've got in blue there the Howard Costello budget surplus period. Labour productivity tends to lag spending on infrastructure, education, training and so on. And from 96 to 2007 is where you had the Howard Costello budget surpluses. 10 years and 11 at budget surpluses. You still had a bit of growth in labour productivity up until about 2002, but the effect of those budget surpluses was to result in labour productivity drop alarmingly towards the end of that particular government. And then you've got the Rudd-Gillard-Swan budget deficit years. Flat line, then started to increase, a lagged effect there. Population growth also undermines, and resource throughput growth, as I said, undermines the productive capacity. Have a look at this. This green line, you've probably heard of a thing called the ecological footprint. Okay, that green line measures Australia's ecological footprint from 1961, sorry, it only goes to about 2005. It's not easy to get, unless you want to pay big bucks to get the data. But that green line is not the ecological footprint, that's Australia's biocapacity. That basically represents the natural resources that Australia, on a per capita basis, has available at its disposal to use for economic purposes. And you can see it's in decline. The brown line is the per capita footprint. Now, of course, because Australia's population is rising, the total footprint's rising, but on a per capita basis, it's been fairly flat. The black line measures the difference, which is the ecological surplus. If the biocapacity is greater than the footprint, you've got a surplus. Australia's quite a rare country in this regard. But you can see the surplus is falling, and it's been falling since. And if it keeps going in its current trend, due to population growth, GDP growth, we're going to have a deficit problem. That's undermining the capacity to produce in the future, to meet the needs of an ageing population. But of course, what's even more important is the ecological footprint versus the biocapacity at the global level. That dotted line is one Earth. That's what we've got available to ourselves. That pinkish sort of line, reddish sort of line, is the global ecological footprint, and you can see that at about 1985, the humanity's ecological footprint was exactly equal to the Earth's biocapacity, and it's exceeded it since, and it's now up near close to about one. That 1.4 represents 1.4 planets. Now, people say to me, how can this doesn't make sense when we've only got one planet? How can you have something measured in more than one planet? What that basically means when you see it up around near 1.4 is it means that in order, say 2001, if that was 1.4, it's more about 1.4, so that's 1.4, that would mean that for the amount of resources that we used in 2001 to be used on a sustainable basis, it would be necessary for us to have access to 1.4 Earths. And the only reason why you can be in that situation for a short period of time is because you don't just live off the income of natural capital, you can eat into the natural capital, and that's what we're doing. Once you go beyond that line, you can do it for a period of time by eating in the natural capital. Not just cutting down the odd tree that's being regenerated by a forest, but cutting into the forest and reducing the size of the forest. And of course you can only do that for a period of time. If you harvest timber at the same rate the forest regenerates, then you can have the timber forever. But we're not doing that. We're now eating into natural capital. So that can only go up for a period of time. Then it will come down. As one of the comments, one of the quotes, if something's impossible or whatever, then it will stop at some point in time. I mentioned that in the intergenerational report, the government's hell-bent on increasing Australia's GDP, which, of course, is one of the driving factors behind these ecological problems. Well, the question that needs to be asked, is this increase in GDP actually making us better off? that blue line there, there's this thing called a genuine progress indicator. That blue line there is the per capita GDP. Once again, sorry, it's 1962 to 2007, so it needs to be updated. That red line is the per capita genuine progress indicator. One of the problems with GDP, it's just a measure of the total volume of economic activity. All right? Regardless of what it is, whether it's something that's beneficial or if it's cleaning up the natural environment. All right? It's called gross domestic product at the national level. It's called gross state product at the state or provincial level. When the Exxon Valdez spilled its oil in Alaska back 20 or so years ago, the GSP, the gross state product of Alaska, went through the roof because of all the money and all the resources that were allocated to Alaska to try and clean it up. Gave the impression that Alaska was better off.
Every car crash increases the GDP.
Yeah, that's right. If you want to increase the GDP, just crash your car into a stobie pole on the way home. or if you're married, get divorced. And if you're in a situation where one of you works and the other one stays home and does the work for you, just employ your ex-partner. GDP will go up and there'll be no increase in economic activity. But what the GPI does is it measures the benefits and the costs of economic activity at the macro level. If in growing the economy, the benefits are rising faster than the costs, then that gap increases and the per capita GPI goes up. But it hasn't been going. In fact, it peaked in about the early 1970s. So all this GDP growth hasn't made us any better off. It doesn't mean that we haven't had extra benefits. We've had extra costs. All these pressures in terms of ecological costs, infrastructure costs. Okay, as was mentioned, when a road is widened, when they spent, believe it or not, I don't know if you were looking at that sign, but where you live in Adelaide, but the intersection of Anzac Highway and South Road, that was $118 million. 118. I don't know if how much it's improved the flow of traffic, but I bet you the flow of traffic through that intersection is no better than what it was 30 years ago when you didn't have that underpass. That's a cost. Because those resources have been used and never be available again. They could have been used to build hospitals. That's the cost of growth. And that's not reflected in GDP. In fact, it is reflected in GDP. It goes up. The GPI, because it's a cost, goes down when those sorts of things happen. So it's not making us better off anyway, and it's undermining our productive capacity. The other thing, research and development spending, I said public spending on research and development is important. Have a look at this here. The blue represents the years in which federal government spending on research and development was at its lowest point. Almost always occurred when governments were running a surplus. Right? There was a surplus in 88, 89, a budget surplus. Right? The Howard Keating budget surplus. Government spending on research and development fell. These are the Howard Costello years in the middle here. You can see that the overall trend is downwards in research and development spending by the federal government. It went up a bit during the stimulus period, short little stimulus period under the Rudd-Gillard-Swan budget deficit period. But you can see when there were budget cuts to try and run the budget back to surplus, which was unnecessary, you saw research and development spending by the federal government start to decline, and it's continuing to decline. So, as I said, federal government's doing everything to undermine the ability of Australia to meet the needs of an ageing population. And that's it.